The solo survival exercise on Verath IV lasted 14 days. It was a standard component of the Galactic Military Institute's advanced field curriculum. 1 cadet, 1 planet, 14 days. Standard issue survival kit containing enough equipment to keep a being alive if they were competent and enough rope to hang themselves with if they were not. No communications except a single emergency beacon that, if activated, ended the exercise immediately and went on the cadet's permanent record as a failure. No extraction until day 14 unless the beacon fired or the cadet stopped transmitting their daily biometric ping. The planet was a good choice for the exercise. Verath IV was Class 3 habitable, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, mean temperature 12 degrees, covered in dense old-growth forest broken by river systems and occasional highland clearings. It had predators, several species of them, none large enough to threaten a prepared cadet, but all large enough to keep the cadet honest. It had weather. It had terrain that rewarded good navigation and punished bad assumptions. Jordan Hayes had been dropped on the night side of Verath IV's eastern continent at 0300 on a Tuesday with a pack on his back and 14 days ahead of him, and had felt, stepping off the transport into the cold dark of an alien forest, something that took him a moment to identify. He felt good. Not comfortable. Not safe. Good. The specific quality of engagement that came from a problem with real parameters and real consequences and no safety net underneath it. He had felt it in Arena 7. He had felt it in the Xanthian holding compartment. He felt it here, standing in 3 centimeters of leaf litter under trees that were 40 meters tall and older than human civilization, with the transport already gone and 14 days of forest in every direction. He oriented himself by the stars, which were not Earth stars, but were stars, and he started walking. By day 3, he had established a base camp in a rock overhang above a river bend, had mapped the immediate terrain to a radius of 4 kilometers, had identified 2 reliable food sources and 1 water source that needed treatment and 1 that did not, had cataloged the predator activity patterns in his area to the degree that he could predict the large cat analog's patrol route to within 40 minutes, and had begun the kind of systematic environmental reading that the exercise's designers had intended to take most cadets the full 14 days to approximate. He was not doing this because he was exceptional at survival. He was doing it because this was how he approached every environment he was placed in. You learned it. You learned it completely, from the inside, until you knew where every fault was and what it would do under pressure. Forest or spaceship or alien academy simulation. Same process. On day 4 he noticed something wrong. It was not a large thing. It was the kind of thing that most beings would have filed as noise, as the normal variation of an unfamiliar environment, as the sort of minor inconsistency that accumulated in any complex system and meant nothing. A set of tracks near the river that did not match the predator profiles he had cataloged. A branch disturbed at a height inconsistent with the local fauna. A silence in the canopy that lasted slightly too long after he moved through a clearing. Jordan filed it and kept moving and paid attention. On day 5, the thing that was wrong came into slightly better focus. He had doubled back on his own trail 3 times, a standard anti-tracking technique that he ran as a matter of habit, and on the 3rd doubling, he found evidence that something had followed his original path and then stopped. Not a predator following a scent. Something that had been tracking his movement and noticed the doubling and adjusted. Jordan sat with this for a while. He was on a remote planet 14 days from extraction with an emergency beacon that would end his career if he used it. Whatever was in the forest with him was intelligent, was tracking him, and had recognized a counter-tracking technique. None of the wildlife profiles for Verath IV included anything with that capability. He thought about what that meant. He thought about it carefully and completely, and when he was done thinking, he made a series of decisions that he did not second-guess once he had made them. He moved his camp. He changed his daily patterns. He started building things he had not originally planned to build. And he began paying attention to the forest in a different way, not reading it for resources and hazards, but reading it for the specific signature of something that was trying to read him. The Mirath had no species name in the Cooperative's xenobiological registry because the Cooperative did not officially know the Mirath existed. This was by design. The Mirath were old. Older than the Cooperative, older than most of the species in it. a solitary predatory species from the outer reaches that had evolved over millions of years into something that the Cooperative's biologists would have found extraordinary and the Cooperative's military would have found terrifying. They were shapeshifters in the precise biological sense, not costume changers, not surface mimics. Their cellular structure was genuinely malleable, capable of restructuring at the molecular level to replicate the physical profile of any organism they had sufficient contact time to model. The replication was not perfect at the cellular level, but it was functionally perfect at the observational level. They could become any being they had studied closely enough. They could hold the form indefinitely. They could switch between forms in approximately 40 seconds. They were also, by nature and long practice, hunters. Patient, methodical, deeply intelligent hunters who had spent millions of years evolving in an environment where everything else was also trying to kill them, and had come out the other end of that process as something that nothing in their environment could reliably stop. Someone in the Cooperative knew they existed. Someone who had access to resources that most beings in the Cooperative did not, and who had a specific problem they needed solved quietly, had found a way to retain one. The problem was Deadliest. Not Jordan specifically, not yet. He was a cadet, young, largely unknown outside the institutions he had passed through. The problem was what he represented. The Cooperative had been built over 4 centuries on a careful balance of species, capabilities, and influence, and the beings who maintained that balance had been maintaining it long enough to recognize when something new entered the system that did not fit the existing equilibrium. Humans were that something. And Deadliest was, to anyone paying close enough attention, the leading edge of what humans were going to become in the Cooperative's military structure. The person who had sent the Verath was paying close enough attention. 14 days on a remote planet. 1 cadet. No communications. A daily biometric ping that confirmed life signs, but not circumstances. An emergency beacon that, if the cadet had the presence of mind to reach it, would bring a transport in 4 hours. 4 hours was longer than the Verath needed. On day 6, Jordan set a trap. It was not the kind of trap the survival exercises designers would have recognized as relevant to their curriculum. It was not for food or for warmth or for any of the standard survival priorities. It was a data trap, a construction designed not to catch anything, but to give him information about what was in the forest with him. He built it over the course of a day, working with the materials the forest provided, constructing something that looked from a distance like a camp, complete enough to draw attention, placed in a location that the forest topography made difficult to approach from most directions and easy to approach from two. Then he positioned himself in a third location, elevated, with good sightlines to both approach vectors, and he waited. Patience was something Jordan had in quantity. He had developed it the same way he had developed everything else, through practice in conditions that made impatience expensive. He sat in his elevated position for 11 hours the first day and 9 hours the second, and he watched. On the morning of day 8, something came. It came from the direction he had assessed as less likely, which told him something about its intelligence. It had looked at the same topography he had looked at, identified the 2 easy approach vectors, and chosen neither of them. It had come through terrain that was genuinely difficult, slowly, over what must have been several hours, and it arrived at the edge of his false camp in the form of one of Verath IV's mid-sized herbivores, a 6-limbed grazing animal that Jordan had cataloged on day 2. He watched it stand at the edge of the camp for a long time. It was not grazing. It was not moving the way herbivores moved. It was still in the particular way that thinking things are still, assessing, reading the space in front of it with an intelligence that the species whose form it wore did not have. Then it looked up, directly at his position. Jordan did not move. He had chosen his position for concealment, as well as sight lines, and he was good at stillness. But the thing in the herbivore's form was looking at exactly the right spot in a stand of trees that offered no obvious visual cue to his presence. It had not seen him. It had reasoned him. They looked at each other across 200 meters of forest floor for a long moment. Then the herbivore turned and walked back into the trees the way it had come. Jordan climbed down from his position and started thinking very hard. He knew 3 things now. The first was that whatever was in the forest with him was not wildlife. It was a directed intelligence operating with intent, and it had been sent here specifically, which meant someone had sent it, which meant this was not a random encounter, and the survival exercise was no longer the primary problem. The second was that it was a shapeshifter of a quality he had not encountered in the Cooperative's xenobiological literature, which meant it was either undocumented or classified, and either way the implications were significant. The third was that it had found his concealed position by reasoning, not by detection, which meant it understood tactical thinking at a level that made it more dangerous than any predator he had trained against. He thought about the emergency beacon. He thought about 4 hours and what 4 hours meant with something like this in the same forest. He thought about his career record and the notation that beacon activation would leave on it. And then he put both of those thoughts aside because they were the wrong considerations, and he knew it. He thought about what he had. He had a pack. He had 14 days of forest knowledge. He had the terrain, which he knew better than the thing in the forest did because he had spent 8 days learning it, and it had spent 8 days learning him. He had the fact that it had shown itself, which meant it had shifted from observation to approach, which meant the timeline had changed for reasons he did not yet know. And he had something else. He had the fact that it was a shapeshifter, that it could become any being it had studied closely enough, that its power was the ability to be something it was not. Jordan thought about what that meant from the other direction. A shapeshifter's entire operational model was built on the assumption that the target could not tell the difference, that the copy was good enough, that when it became something familiar and trusted, the target's own pattern recognition would do the rest of the work. It had spent 8 days studying him. He had spent 8 days studying it. The question was which of them had learned more. On day 9 it came as him. He was at the river, the real river, filling his water container, and he heard footsteps behind him that matched his own gait precisely, and he turned and looked at himself. It was good. He had to give it that. The physical replication was extraordinary. His height, his build, his face, his uniform, the specific way he held his weight slightly forward on his left foot that was a habit from a knee injury 2 years ago that he had never fully corrected. It had watched him for 8 days, and it had built him from the outside in with a precision that was genuinely unsettling. It was standing 8 meters away. It was looking at him with his own eyes. It was waiting for something, a response, a hesitation, a moment of the particular human psychological disruption that came from seeing your own face looking back at you. Jordan looked at it for a moment. He said, "You have my stance wrong." The thing wearing his face went very still. "Left foot," Jordan said. "You have the weight distribution reversed. I favor my left because of the knee. You have it on the right." He said it the way he said everything. Flat. Informational. Not to unsettle it. Because it was true and truth was data and data was always worth having. The thing processed this. He watched it process it. There was a moment, very brief, where the face that was his face showed something that his face did not show, something that lived in its actual biology underneath the mimicry, a flicker of something he did not have a word for. Then it stopped being him. It went through the transition in less than 40 seconds, the cellular restructuring that was its actual nature, and what it became was something he had never seen before and suspected very few beings had. Its default form, what it actually was underneath everything it had ever pretended to be. Large, dense, low to the ground with a forward-leaning posture that suggested a species that had evolved to chase things down over long distances. For limbs, the upper 2 longer than the lower, adapted for both locomotion and grappling. Its skin was the color of old bark and had a texture that was not quite either. It looked at him with eyes that were its own eyes. Jordan looked back. He had 8 meters and whatever was in his pack and 14 days of knowing this forest, and one piece of information that the thing in front of him did not know he had. On day 7, while he was building the false camp, he had found something in the forest that he had cataloged and filed and not used yet. A particular flowering plant, common in the highland areas, that Verath IV's large cat analog actively avoided. Not because it was toxic, because its pollen compound disrupted the sensory system that the cat analog used for tracking. The disruption was temporary, species-specific, and largely irrelevant to a survival exercise. Unless you were facing something that had spent 8 days building a sensory model of you and was relying on that model to track you through terrain it knew less well than you did. Jordan had been carrying a sealed container of the pollen compound since day 7. He broke the seal now, with his thumb, without looking at it, and threw it directly at the thing across the river and ran. What followed was 14 hours. He did not run straight. He ran the way he had run every counter-tracking pattern for the last 8 days, using the terrain he knew, buying distance in directions that cost the thing behind him more than they cost him. Moving through the sections of forest he had mapped against the sections it would have to navigate without a map. It was faster than him in open ground. He had established this within the first 20 minutes and adjusted. He was not trying to outrun it. He was trying to outlast it. The pollen compound had disrupted its sensory tracking for approximately 4 hours. He used the 4 hours to build distance, and then he used the distance to build something. He had been planning this since day 7. The materials were cached at 2 locations he had established during the camp-building phase. He moved between them with the efficiency of someone who had placed them there knowing he would need them in exactly this sequence. What he built was not a weapon. He did not have materials for a weapon that would be relevant against something with that biology. What he built was a problem, the specific kind of problem that used a thing's own capabilities against it. The Verath was a shapeshifter. It became things by studying them closely. It relied on the accuracy of its models. Its entire operational existence was built around the quality of its mimicry. Jordan built a version of himself that was wrong in 17 specific ways. Tracks that matched his gait pattern but placed slightly differently than the terrain actually demanded. A camp that had his habits in it, but sequenced incorrectly. Signs of movement that told a coherent story about where he had gone that did not match where he actually was. He built a false Jordan in the forest the way he had built the false camp, with enough truth to read as genuine and enough wrongness to matter. He had been watching the thing study him for 8 days. He knew what it was looking for. He knew what it waited. He built the false Jordan to satisfy exactly those waits. Then he climbed a tree and waited. The Verath found the false trail on the 11th hour. He watched it from 40 meters up, in a tree it had not looked at because the false trail led away from it, as it moved through the forest reading the signs he had left. It was in his form again, which told him the pollen disruption had worn off, and it had rebuilt its model. It moved through the false camp with the careful attention of a predator that had been operating for a long time and knew when something was off. It stopped in the middle of the false camp. Jordan was watching its face, which was his face, and he watched it work through the 17 wrongnesses one by one. It was fast, faster than he had hoped. It took it 6 minutes to identify enough discrepancies to know the camp was constructed, to know it had been led here. It looked up, not at his tree, at the sky, at the angle of the light, at the shape of the canopy in a 360-degree survey that was methodical and unhurried and was going to find him in approximately 2 more minutes. Jordan dropped out of the tree. He dropped the full 40 meters, which was not survivable under normal circumstances, and was survivable under his circumstances because he had spent 3 days constructing a deceleration rig between the tree and the ground that arrested his fall in the last 8 meters and deposited him on the forest floor at a running pace instead of a terminal one. He had built it on day 8, when he had decided that the end game of this situation was going to require doing something that the thing hunting him had not modeled as physically possible. He hit the ground running. The Verath was 12 meters away and turning. He covered the 12 meters before it finished turning and hit it with everything he had in a tackle that targeted the forward lean of its posture, the biomechanical vulnerability of a species built to chase rather than brace, and drove it into the ground. What followed was not a fight in any technical sense. It was a sustained physical argument between a human who had grown up on a high-gravity world and trained for 3 years and was operating on 31 hours without sleep and 7 days of managed nutrition and complete focused intention, and a shapeshifter that was genuinely more powerful than him in most measurable ways, and was losing because it was on its back in terrain it did not know and being held there by something that would not stop. It shifted twice trying to change the geometry. Jordan adjusted twice. It was faster. He was more committed. There is a difference between an organism that is dangerous and an organism that has decided, completely and without reservation, that the current situation ends one specific way and no other way is acceptable. The Verath had never encountered the second kind before. Jordan got the restraint line around it on the 3rd attempt. He had been carrying the line for 3 days in preparation for a conclusion he had not been certain he could reach. He pulled the restraint tight and sat back on the forest floor and breathed. The Verath was still, not dead, restrained and still, watching him with its own eyes, the bark-colored eyes and the bark-colored face that was its actual face, assessing him the way it had been assessing him since day 4. Jordan looked back at it. He said, "I know you were sent. I know why. He paused. I need to know by whom. The Verath was silent. You studied me for 8 days, Jordan said. You know I'm not asking to hurt you. I'm asking because the person who sent you is a bigger problem than you are, and I need to understand the shape of it. The forest was very quiet around them. After a long time, the Verath made a sound. Not words in any language Jordan knew, but a sound with structure, with cadence, with the architecture of communication rather than noise. Jordan listened to it carefully. He did not understand it, but he filed it completely, every note and interval and pause, the way he filed everything. He would find someone who could translate it. He had 5 days left on Verath IV, and an emergency beacon he had not used, and 14 days of forest knowledge, and something restrained on the ground in front of him that someone powerful in the Cooperative had sent to make sure he did not come back. He was coming back. He started working on the problem of getting them both off the planet. On day 14, the extraction transport set down in the Highland clearing at 0600 as scheduled. The transport crew were expecting 1 cadet with a pack and 14 days of field experience. They found 1 cadet with a pack, 14 days of field experience, 31 hours of recorded audio in a language no one on the transport recognized, and a restrained Verath that the cadet had somehow kept alive and cooperative for 5 days using a combination of forest resources and what the crew could only describe as an extremely determined commitment to interspecies communication. The transport commander, a veteran Velhari officer named Sewell who had been running extraction missions for 11 years and had seen cadets come out of Verath IV in every possible condition, looked at Jordan Hayes for a long moment. She looked at the Verath. She looked back at Jordan. She said, "Your biometric ping never indicated elevated distress." "I managed it," Jordan said. "For 14 days. The first 3 days were fine," Jordan said. "It was the last 11 that required attention." Sewell looked at the Verath again. It looked back at her with its bark-colored eyes. It was, as far as she could assess, unharmed. It was also, as far as she could assess, regarding the human cadet beside it with something that her 11 years of reading alien body language suggested was not hostility. She had no category for what she was looking at. She let them both on the transport. She filed a report that evening that she marked at the highest classification level she had authority to apply, which was not high enough, she suspected, for what she had just seen. She added a note at the bottom. The note said, "Someone sent this thing to kill him. He came back with it alive and talking. I do not know what that means for whoever sent it." She thought about it for a moment and added one more line. "I do not know what that means for the rest of us either."